Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories, here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The woman smiled, and her black eyes reflected the flickering light from the bone cabin like oil. Now comes the real test, Ranger. Burke was just the appetizer. I'm the main course. She began to circle me, moving with a fluid grace that didn't look entirely human. You see, the forest learns from each hunter it creates. Burke was crude, obvious. He relied too much on technology and brute force. But I understand the subtler arts. As she moved, the clearing began to change around us. The bone cabin flickered and wavered, sometimes appearing as the grotesque structure I'd seen before, other times looking like a normal Park Service building. The trees shifted positions, creating new pathways and blocking old ones. Reality is more flexible than most people understand, the woman said conversationally. Especially in places like this, where the barriers between dimensions have worn thin. Burke never learned how to really manipulate that flexibility. He was content to use the forest's gifts without understanding their true potential. I tried to move toward what looked like a gap between the trees, but the forest rearranged itself before I could reach it. Everywhere I turned, I found myself facing the woman and the impossible cabin. "What do you want?" I asked. "The same thing the forest wants. The same thing Burke wanted. Food. But not just your body, Ranger. Your mind. Your memories. Your understanding of how the Park Service operates. Imagine what I could do with that knowledge. How many search and rescue operations I could manipulate. How many accidents I could arrange." The bone cabin pulsed like a heart, and with each pulse, I could hear the voices inside growing louder, more desperate. Vera's voice rose above the others, calling my name, begging me to save her. "She's still alive," the woman said, noticing my reaction. "They all are, in a sense. The forest doesn't just consume flesh, it preserves consciousness, keeps the awareness intact while slowly digesting everything else. They'll remain aware for years, decades, maybe centuries, long enough to understand exactly what they've become part of." She gestured toward the cabin, and the door mouth opened wider, revealing a glimpse of the horror inside. I could see figures suspended in what looked like amber or tree sap, their eyes moving, their mouths opening and closing in silent screams. "But that doesn't have to be your fate," the woman continued. "Join us willingly, and you can maintain your humanity much longer. Help us expand our hunting grounds, and you'll have power beyond anything you've imagined." "Never," I said, echoing my earlier response to Burke. The woman sighed. "I was hoping you'd be more reasonable than the others, but no matter. The forest has other ways of convincing people." The clearing began to change again, but this time it wasn't just rearranging itself. It was expanding, growing larger, revealing more of the forest's true nature. I could see other structures now, more bone buildings arranged in a rough approximation of a town. And between them, moving with purposeful intent, were dozens of figures. Some looked human, others were clearly something else entirely. "Welcome to the real Olympic National Park," the woman said. "The part that doesn't appear on any map. The part that existed long before the first human ever set foot in these woods, and will exist long after the last human is gone." In the distance, I could see what looked like a massive tree, larger than any living thing had a right to be. Its trunk disappeared into the sky above, and its roots spread out in all directions, connecting to every other tree in the forest. And in the bark of that impossible tree I could see faces, thousands of them, all looking out at me with expressions of infinite sadness and terror. "Every person who's ever disappeared in these woods," the woman said, following my gaze. "Every hiker, every hunter, every park ranger who thought they understood what they were dealing with. They're all still here, all still conscious, all still hoping that someone will find them and set them free." The weight of that revelation hit me like a physical blow. Hundreds of people, maybe thousands, all preserved in living hell, their suffering extending indefinitely, and I was about to join them. But you don't have to, the woman said, reading my thoughts. You can choose to work with us instead of against us. Help us expand beyond these woods. Help us take our operation to other parks, other forests. Think of the efficiency we could achieve with your insider knowledge. As she spoke, the bone cabin began to move toward me, or perhaps I was being drawn toward it. Either way, the distance between us was shrinking, and I could smell the decay and corruption emanating from within. That's when my radio crackled to life. Brennan, this is Ranger Station. Do you copy? The woman froze, her black eyes widening with something that might have been fear. That's impossible. Nothing electronic works in here unless we allow it. Chief Voss's voice came through clearly. Brennan, we're tracking your GPS signal. Search team is en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. The GPS unit in my pack began beeping, its screen flickering back to life. My backup flashlight clicked on by itself, cutting through the supernatural darkness. The woman's face contorted with rage and something else. Panic. No, this is our domain. Ours. But something was changing in the clearing. The geometric precision of the trees was wavering, branches shifting back to more natural positions. The bone cabin flickered like a mirage, occasionally revealing what looked like a simple hunting blind made of branches and camouflage netting. Even the massive tree in the distance was fading, becoming translucent. The spell's breaking, Vera called weakly from somewhere nearby. I could see her now, tied to a tree at the edge of the clearing, not suspended in supernatural amber as I'd thought. When the rescue team gets close enough, this place can't maintain the illusion. It's not strong enough to fool multiple people at once. The woman spun toward Vera, her form already becoming less solid, less defined. Then we'll have to work faster. But I was ready for her. With my equipment working again, with the unnatural influence of the clearing weakening, I felt more like myself. I lunged toward Vera, tackling the woman before she could reach the tree where my colleague was bound. She was still stronger than she looked, still had advantages I didn't understand, but now we were fighting on something closer to equal terms. As we struggled, I could hear the sound of voices in the distance, real voices this time, calling my name. Brennan, where are you? The rescue team. They'd found us. The woman heard them too, and the sound seemed to drain all the fight out of her. She sagged beneath me, suddenly looking like what she really was, something that had once been human but had been changed by years of exposure to the forest's influence. You don't understand, she whispered. This place, it needs to feed. It's been hungry for so long. Without us to bring it what it wants, it'll find other ways, worse ways. But whatever she was going to say was cut off as flashlight beams swept across the clearing. The rescue team had found us. What followed was a blur of activity. EMTs treating Vera and 2 other victims who had been hidden throughout the clearing. Hikers who'd gone missing over the past month. The woman taken into custody, though she seemed to be fading even as they handcuffed her, becoming less substantial with each passing minute. Me giving statement after statement, trying to explain what had happened in terms that made sense. The official report listed the incident as an elaborate hoax perpetrated by a mentally unstable individual who used sophisticated audio equipment and psychological manipulation to terrorize hikers. The strange effects I'd experienced, the equipment failures, the changing landscape, the impossible geometry, were attributed to stress, disorientation, and the forest's well-documented ability to confuse navigation equipment due to magnetic anomalies in the rock formations. The woman, whose real name turned out to be Margaret Thorne, was described as a former park employee who had suffered a psychotic break after losing her family in a hiking accident 5 years earlier. She'd been living rough in the forest ever since, gradually developing an elaborate fantasy about supernatural forces and ancient hungers. That's the version that went in the files. That's the version that made sense to everyone involved. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain how Margaret managed to survive 5 years in the wilderness without any visible means of support. It doesn't explain how she could have set up such an elaborate audio system in a part of the forest that supposedly had no power source, no way to maintain the equipment. And it definitely doesn't explain what happened to Margaret herself. She died in custody the same night she was arrested, but not in the way you might expect. The guards found her cell empty in the morning, with no sign of forced entry or escape. The only thing left behind was a pile of what looked like mulch, decomposed organic matter that might once have been wood, leaves, and other forest debris. The official explanation was that she had somehow smuggled in a chemical that dissolved her body, part of an elaborate suicide plan. But the forensics team never found any trace of such a chemical, and the organic matter in the cell didn't match Margaret's DNA. It was as if she had simply returned to the forest. The other victims recovered physically, but their testimonies were inconsistent, fragmented. Vera remembered being captured by someone she described as Burke, but couldn't explain how she knew that name, since the official investigation never found any evidence of such a person. The other hikers spoke of impossible architecture, voices in the darkness, and a sense of being watched by something vast and hungry, but their accounts were dismissed as trauma-induced hallucinations. I lasted another 2 months as a ranger before I couldn't take it anymore. The nightmares were constant, not just about Burke and Margaret, but about the voices, the changing forest, the sensation that something vast and hungry was still out there, waiting. Every time I patrolled that section of the park, I could feel it watching me. But more than that, I was changing. Small things at first. I found myself hearing sounds that other people couldn't, seeing movement in my peripheral vision that wasn't there when I turned to look. Sometimes I would catch myself talking to the trees during my patrols, and they seemed to talk back, whispering secrets about the hikers who passed through their domain. The worst part was that I was starting to understand what Burke and Margaret had been talking about. The forest did have its own intelligence, its own needs, and human beings were nothing more than a renewable resource to be harvested when necessary. When I realized I was starting to think of the park's visitors as potential prey rather than people I was sworn to protect, I knew it was time to leave. So I quit, packed up everything I owned, and moved as far away as I could get. Here in Arizona, the desert is clean, open, honest. What you see is what you get. No ancient forests with their own agenda, no places where reality gets thin and things bleed through. But sometimes, late at night when the wind is howling across the desert, I still hear them, the voices, calling my name, asking me to come back, promising that next time will be different. They tell me that Margaret was weak, that Burke was crude, but that I could be different. I could be better, and the worst part, sometimes I want to go. Because even now, 7 years later, I'm not entirely sure what really happened in that clearing. Was Margaret just a sick woman who used technology and psychology to create the illusion of supernatural events? Or was there something else in those woods, something that had been there long before she arrived and will be there long after she's gone? I think about Vera sometimes. Wonder if she knows something she's never told anyone. She moved back to Portland after the incident, quit photography, and as far as I know, never spoke publicly about what happened. But last year, I saw an article about her in a Portland newspaper. She'd become a successful real estate agent, specializing in properties far from forested areas. The article mentioned that she'd developed an unusual phobia of trees and refused to show properties with more than a few scattered shrubs in the yard. That doesn't sound like someone who was simply the victim of an elaborate hoax. The article also mentioned that she'd started a blog called Safe Spaces, where she reviewed hiking trails and camping areas across the Pacific Northwest. But what made the blog unique was that she only recommended locations with excellent cell phone coverage, multiple exit routes, and heavy foot traffic. Places where, as she put it, you're never really alone. I subscribed to her blog under a fake name, and I've been reading it religiously for months. Most of it is exactly what you'd expect. Practical advice about safe hiking practices, gear recommendations, weather warnings. But sometimes, buried in the middle of seemingly innocent trail reviews, she includes warnings that are much more specific. Avoid the Bogachiel River area after sunset. The old growth sections of the Hoh River Trail should only be visited in groups of 4 or more. If you hear voices calling for help in the Olympic backcountry, do not investigate alone. Return to the trailhead and contact park services immediately. She never explains these warnings, never mentions her own experience, but they're there for anyone who knows how to read between the lines. And based on the comment section of her blog, there are other people who understand exactly what she's talking about. Former park employees, longtime hikers, locals who grew up near the Olympic Peninsula. They all seem to know about places that should be avoided, sounds that shouldn't be followed, and sights that are better left unexplained. There's a whole community of people out there who know that some places are simply wrong, but who can't talk about it openly because who would believe them? I'm telling this story now because I read something in the news last week that made my blood run cold. Another hiker has gone missing in Olympic National Park. A young photographer from Oregon, following the same route Vera had planned to take. Her name is Sarah Chen, and according to the report, she was last seen heading toward the Bogachil River area, the same area where everything happened. Part of me wants to believe it's just a coincidence. People get lost in the wilderness all the time, and Olympic is a big, dangerous place even without supernatural influences. But part of me, the part that still wakes up hearing voices in the wind, knows better. That place is still hungry, and it's still feeding. The news reports about Sarah's disappearance have been frustratingly vague, but I've been following the story obsessively. The search and rescue operations have been more extensive than usual, involving multiple agencies and even some military personnel. That suggests they've found something that concerns them, something that can't be explained by a simple hiking accident. More telling is what they haven't found. No trace of Sarah's equipment, no footprints, no evidence that she ever made it to her planned campsite. It's as if she simply vanished somewhere between the trailhead and her destination. But buried in one of the later news reports was a detail that made my hands shake as I read it. One of the search and rescue volunteers reported hearing strange sounds during the overnight search operations. Voices calling for help from areas that had already been thoroughly searched. The volunteer's report was dismissed as stress and exhaustion. But I know better. The forest is active again. It's hunting. Yesterday I did something I swore I'd never do. I called the Olympic National Park Ranger Station and asked to speak with whoever was coordinating the search for Sarah Chen. I didn't identify myself as a former ranger. I just said I was a concerned citizen with information that might be relevant. The ranger I spoke with was professional, but clearly frustrated. "Sir, we appreciate your concern, but we've received dozens of calls from people claiming to have information about the missing hiker. Unless you have concrete, verifiable information about Ms. Chen's whereabouts." "I don't," I interrupted. "But I need you to listen to me very carefully. Do not send search teams into the Bogachil River area alone. Do not follow voices calling for help unless you can visually confirm the source. And if anyone reports equipment failures or spatial disorientation in that area, pull them out immediately." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, who is this? What's your background with search and rescue operations?" I hung up without answering. Part of me wanted to tell him everything, to try to make him understand what his teams were really dealing with. But I knew how that conversation would go. I'd sound like every other crank caller who thinks they have special insight into ongoing investigations. The truth is, there's nothing I can do to help Sarah Chen. If she's in the same place I was 7 years ago, then she's either already dead or she's become part of something much worse than death. And if the forest has evolved, learned new tricks, developed new appetites since Margaret's disappearance, then even experienced search teams won't be enough to stop what's coming. But I can tell this story. I can put it out there for people to read, to judge for themselves, to maybe remember if they ever find themselves in a similar situation. If you're planning to visit Olympic National Park, please, stay on the marked trails. Don't chase voices calling for help, no matter how real they sound. Don't trust your equipment if it starts behaving strangely. And if you find yourself in a part of the forest where the trees grow in perfect patterns and the ground pulses with its own rhythm, run, and don't look back. Because some places aren't meant for human beings. Some places have appetites that can't be satisfied, only temporarily sated. And some bargains once made echo through time long after the people who made them are gone. I've spent 7 years trying to convince myself that what happened in that clearing was just a combination of human madness and natural disorientation amplified by my own fear and confusion. 7 years telling myself that there's a rational explanation for everything. But deep down, in the part of my mind that still remembers what it felt like to stand in that impossible place, I know the truth. Olympic National Park has secrets older than human civilization, and some of those secrets are still very much alive. Sarah Chen is still missing. The search was called off after 3 weeks. No trace found. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed. If I should have become what Burke and Margaret were, guardians of sorts, people who understood the bargain and could control it. People who could feed the forest what it needed while protecting everyone else. But then I remember Burke's face in those final moments, the terror and regret, the understanding that he'd sold his soul for power he could never really control. And I remember Margaret, dissolving back into the organic matter she'd been slowly becoming all along. No, I made the right choice coming to Arizona. Here, the only things that hunt humans are other humans, and that's a kind of evil I can understand. Out there in those ancient forests, where the trees remember things that happened before history began, there are hungers that go deeper than human madness. There are places where the rules we think govern reality become flexible. And there are voices, still calling in the darkness, promising answers to questions we're not meant to ask. I hope Sarah Chen is just lost. I hope she found her way out of the forest and decided to start a new life somewhere far away, like I did. But I don't think that's what happened, and God help me. Part of me is tempted to go back and find out for sure. But I won't. I can't. Because if I'm right about what that place really is, then going back would mean becoming part of it. And there are already enough voices calling from those woods, they don't need mine added to the chorus. Last night I had the dream again, the one where I'm standing in that clearing watching the bone cabin pulse like a heart, listening to the voices of everyone who's ever disappeared in those woods. But this time, the dream was different. This time, I wasn't alone in the clearing. Sarah Chen was there, standing next to the cabin, her camera hanging around her neck. She looked at me with eyes that were starting to turn black around the edges, and she smiled. "It's beautiful here, Silas," she said. "Once you stop fighting it, it's really quite beautiful. The forest has so much to teach us, so much to show us. You should come back. You should see what you've been missing." I woke up screaming, and my wife had to shake me for several minutes before I fully came back to myself. She asked me what the dream was about, and I told her the same thing I always tell her, that it was just stress, just my mind processing old trauma. But I know better, because in the dream, Sarah knew my name, and she knew things about me that she couldn't possibly know. Things that only someone who had been touched by that place could understand. The forest is calling, and its reach is growing longer every year. Sometimes I think the only reason I haven't gone back is because I'm a coward, because I'm afraid of what I might find there or what I might become. But lately, I've been wondering if my fear is the only thing standing between that place and the rest of the world. What happens when it gets tired of taking hikers one at a time? What happens when it decides to expand beyond the boundaries of the park? What happens when it realizes that there are bigger, easier targets in the cities and towns that surround its domain? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I have a feeling I'm going to find out soon enough. The voices are getting louder every night, and they're not just calling my name anymore. They're calling everyone's name. Word count: 7,412. The account of Silas Brennan. 7 years have passed since I left Washington. 7 years living here in Arizona, where the desert is dry, open, where you can see for miles in any direction. Nothing like those dense, humid forests of Olympic National Park, where century-old trees block out the sun even at noon and where some things should never have happened. My name is Silas Brennan. I'm 29 now, and I work security at a casino in Phoenix. Simple life, predictable. But from 2016 to 2018, I was a forest ranger at Olympic National Park in Washington State. 2 years that completely changed who I am. 2 years that ended with the case of Vera Castellanos. I've been in therapy since I moved here. My therapist says talking about it might help, that keeping it bottled up is what's causing the nightmares, the panic attacks whenever I hear certain sounds. My wife thinks I should let sleeping dogs lie, but I can't shake the feeling that someone needs to know. That maybe, if I tell this story, it might prevent someone else from going through what I went through. What happened in October 2018 is the reason I left my dream job, packed up everything, and moved 200 miles away to a place where the landscape is the complete opposite of those ancient, whispering forests. Here in Arizona, at least the threats you can see coming. In the Olympic Peninsula, well, you'll understand soon enough. I still wake up some nights hearing that sound, that crying echoing through the trees. My wife shakes me awake, tells me I was talking in my sleep again, mumbling about voices calling from the dark. The doctors say it's PTSD, and maybe they're right. But PTSD doesn't explain everything that happened during those 4 days in October. It doesn't explain what I saw, what I heard, or why Vera Castellanos was found the way she was. Before I start, I need you to understand something. I was a good ranger. Not the best, maybe. I'd only been on the job for 2 years. But I knew those trails, I knew the protocols, and I genuinely cared about keeping people safe. I followed procedures to the letter, checked in religiously with dispatch, maintained my equipment. I wasn't some rookie who panicked at the first sign of trouble. But Olympic National Park, it's different from other places. It's ancient in a way that makes you feel small, insignificant. Nearly 1 million acres of temperate rainforest, mountains, and coastline. Some parts of that forest have never been touched by human feet. Trees older than Christ himself reach up into perpetual twilight, their branches so thick they create their own weather systems. The Hoh River runs through it like a vein of silver, and the whole place breathes with a life that predates civilization. During autumn, when the fog rolls in from the Pacific and settles between those massive trunks, when darkness comes at 5 p.m. and the temperature drops to just above freezing, that's when Olympic shows its true face. That's when you realize you're not the apex predator you think you are. October 15th, 2018. That's when Vera Castellanos was reported missing. Vera was a 28-year-old nature photographer from Portland. She'd been documenting the old-growth forest for some environmental magazine. One of those people who could disappear into the wilderness for days with just a backpack and come out with images that made you believe in magic again. She'd obtained all the proper permits, filed her backcountry itinerary, done everything right. She was supposed to check in every 48 hours via satellite phone. She missed her first check-in. In most cases, a missed check-in isn't immediate cause for panic. Equipment fails, weather interferes, people get caught up in their work and forget to call. We usually give it another 12 hours before initiating a search. But Vera's boyfriend, Marcus, called our station in a state that immediately got our attention. She would never miss a check-in, he insisted, his voice tight with worry. Never. She's obsessive about safety protocols. Something's wrong. I was the one who took that call. October 15th, around 3 p.m., the afternoon light already starting to fade through the station windows. I'd drawn duty that day because my partner, Ranger Coleman, was out with the flu. Marcus provided Vera's last known coordinates. She'd been heading to a remote section near the Bogachiel River, deep in the park's interior where some of the largest Sitka spruces still stood. My supervisor, Chief Ranger Patricia Voss, made the decision to initiate an immediate search. Something about the boyfriend's certainty, maybe, or just an instinct born from 20 years in the service. She assigned me to lead the initial reconnaissance. Take the ATV as far as you can, then go on foot, she instructed. Radio check every 30 minutes. If you don't find sign of her by dark, we'll call in a full team tomorrow morning. I remember feeling a mixture of excitement and responsibility. This was my first time leading a search operation, and I was determined to prove myself capable. I loaded up my gear, GPS unit, emergency medical kit, extra batteries, flares, rope, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, and my service radio. Standard search and rescue loadout. I also carried a .40 caliber Glock 22, park service issue, though in 2 years I'd never had to draw it for anything more threatening than an aggressive black bear. The drive to the trailhead took 45 minutes on winding park roads that grew progressively narrower and more primitive. By the time I reached Vera's last known access point, the sun was already sinking behind the mountains, painting the sky that particular shade of October orange that always made me think of jack-o'-lanterns and ghost stories. I parked the ATV and shouldered my pack. The trailhead was marked by a simple wooden sign, weathered and worn. Bogachil River Trail, backcountry permit required. Below it, someone had carved "Turn Back" into the wood. Probably some hiker's idea of a joke, but in the gathering dusk, it gave me an unexpected chill. The trail started easy enough, a well-maintained path that wound through second-growth Douglas fir. But within a mile it devolved into something more primitive, a narrow track marked only by occasional blazes on tree trunks, threading between massive fallen logs and through undergrowth that seemed to close in behind me as I passed. Olympic's temperate rainforest is unlike anywhere else in the continental United States. The air itself feels alive, thick with moisture, and the smell of decomposition and growth happening simultaneously. Moss coats everything. Not just the ground, but the trees, the rocks, even the air seems green with it. Sound behaves strangely there. Sometimes you can hear a squirrel chittering from what seems like miles away. Other times a branch can snap 10 feet from you and the sound gets swallowed by the forest like it never happened. As I hiked deeper, following Vera's planned route according to her filed itinerary, I began to notice things that didn't feel right. Small things at first. A trail marker that seemed to be facing the wrong direction. Boot prints in the mud that looked too large to be from a woman Vera's size. I made notes of everything, taking GPS coordinates and photos with my digital camera. About 2 miles in, I found her first campsite. The site was in a small clearing beside the river, exactly where her itinerary indicated she'd planned to spend her first night. Her tent was gone, but the ground still showed the rectangular impression where it had been pitched. More concerning were the signs of a hasty departure, a scattered pile of ashes where her campfire had been, a protein bar wrapper caught in nearby bushes, and most troubling, her backup water filter lying beside the river as if it had been dropped. I radioed in my findings. Ranger Station, this is Brennan. I've located subject's first campsite. Evidence suggests possible hasty departure. No sign of distress, but she left behind equipment, continuing to second planned location. Chief Voss's voice crackled back through the radio. Copy that, Brennan. How's your battery level? I checked my radio. Showing full bars, Chief. Good. Sun's setting fast out there. If you don't locate her at the second site, return to base and we'll organize a full team for first light. Understood. But as I continued along the trail, following the river deeper into the park's interior, the forest began to feel different. The trees seemed larger, older, their trunks disappearing into a canopy so thick that even at mid-afternoon it felt like twilight beneath them. The sound of the river faded to a distant murmur, and in its place came something else, a silence so complete it felt oppressive. That's when I heard the first voice. It was distant, barely audible above the whisper of wind in the branches. A woman's voice calling for help. My heart rate spiked and I immediately changed direction, heading toward the sound. Hello? I called out. Vera? Vera Castellanos? The voice came again, clearer this time. Help me, please. I crashed through the undergrowth, following the sound, my radio bouncing against my hip as I ran. The voice led me deeper into the forest, away from the marked trail, into terrain that grew increasingly difficult to navigate. Fallen trees created a maze of obstacles, and the ground became spongy, unreliable. The trees here were different too, larger, their bark taking on an almost metallic sheen in the fading light. Some of them had growths that looked disturbingly organic, like tumors or scar tissue wrapped around the trunks. The air grew thicker as I ran, harder to breathe, carrying scents that didn't belong in a healthy forest. Under the normal smells of moss and decomposing leaves was something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. And beneath that, barely perceptible, the copper tang of old blood. I had to stop several times to catch my breath, which was strange. I was in good shape, ran 5 miles every morning before my shift, but here, in this part of the forest, every breath felt insufficient, like the air itself was somehow thinner, less nourishing. But when I reached the area where the voice had seemed to originate, there was nothing. No sign of human passage, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. just ancient trees standing like silent sentinels in the gathering dusk. The silence was so complete it felt like a physical presence, pressing against my eardrums. I stood perfectly still, listening, waiting. The voice had been so clear, so close. She had to be nearby. But as the minutes passed and I heard nothing but my own labored breathing, doubt began to creep in. Had I imagined it? Was the stress of leading my first search operation making me hear things that weren't there? Then I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The trees around me weren't just standing in random forest growth patterns. They were arranged in a rough circle, perfectly spaced, as if they'd been planted that way. But these were old-growth trees, some of them easily 300 years old. They couldn't have been planted by humans. Looking closer, I saw that each tree in the circle bore strange markings in its bark. Not the random scarring you'd expect from weather and wildlife, but deliberate cuts that formed symbols I didn't recognize. The cuts were old, grown over with new bark, but still visible if you knew where to look. I called out again, waited, listened. Nothing but the forest breathing around me. I pulled out my GPS unit to mark my location and get my bearings back to the trail. But when I looked at the screen, it showed something impossible. According to the GPS, I was standing in the middle of the Bogachil River. The display flickered, then went completely dead. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I tried turning the unit off and on again, but the screen remained black. I checked my radio. Dead. My backup flashlight wouldn't turn on, though I'd tested it that morning. Even my watch had stopped, the hands frozen at 4:47, but it was the temperature that really unnerved me. When I'd left the trailhead, it had been a crisp but comfortable October afternoon, maybe 55 degrees. Now, in the space of what couldn't have been more than 20 minutes, the temperature had dropped dramatically. I could see my breath misting in the air and my fingers were starting to go numb despite my gloves. In the growing darkness, with none of my electronic equipment functioning, I felt the first real spike of fear. But I was trained for this. Equipment fails, that's why rangers learn navigation by natural means. I could use the river sound to orient myself, follow it back to the trail. Except I couldn't hear the river anymore. The silence was absolute now. Unnatural. In a healthy forest, there should always be sound. Birds, insects, small mammals moving through the underbrush. But this was the kind of silence you hear in dead places, in areas where nothing lives. It was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears, the sound of my breathing abnormally loud. I stood perfectly still, trying to calm my racing heart and think logically. The trail couldn't be more than 100 yards away. I'd been running in roughly a straight line. All I had to do was turn around and retrace my steps. But when I turned around, the forest looked completely different. The trees I'd just passed through were gone, replaced by larger, more ancient giants that I didn't remember seeing. The faint path I'd crashed through while chasing the voice had vanished. Even the ground looked wrong. Instead of the normal forest floor of decomposing leaves and moss, there was something that looked almost crystalline, like black glass that reflected no light. It was as if the forest had rearranged itself while my back was turned. That's when I heard the child crying. It was a sound that cut through the silence like a knife, the desperate, heartbroken sobbing of a lost child. Every instinct I had as both a ranger and a human being screamed at me to find that child, to help. But something deeper, some primitive part of my brain that still remembered when humans were prey animals, told me to run. The crying seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing off the massive tree trunks in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint a direction. Sometimes it seemed to be right beside me, other times distant and fading, and beneath the crying, barely audible, I swore I could hear other sounds, whispers, conversations in languages I didn't recognize, laughter that didn't sound quite human. The worst part was that the crying sounded familiar. Not like I'd heard this specific child before, but like I'd heard crying exactly like it. It took me several terrifying minutes to place the memory. It was the sound my little sister Sarah had made when she'd gotten lost in the corn maze at the county fair when we were kids. She'd been 8 years old, and I'd been 12, and it had taken us 2 hours to find her. She'd cried exactly like this, raw, desperate, terrified. But Sarah was 31 now, lived in Portland with her husband and 2 kids. She was safe in her suburban home, probably making dinner for her family. The crying couldn't be hers. Could it? I started walking, picking a direction and sticking to it, hoping to find anything familiar. But the forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, a maze of identical trees and shadows. My working flashlight had been in my hand when everything went dark, but now I couldn't find it anywhere. I searched through my pack by touch. The medical kit was there, my water bottles, the emergency shelter, but none of my lights were working. As I moved through the darkness, I began to notice that the trees themselves were wrong. Not just their arrangement, but their very structure. Some of them had too many branches, others too few. Some grew in spirals that hurt to follow with your eyes. And all of them seemed to be watching me, their bark patterns forming faces that shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them. The ground under my feet felt unstable, like walking on a trampoline. Each step seemed to sink further than it should, and I could swear I felt movement beneath the surface, as if something large was stirring in the earth below. The crying stopped suddenly, replaced by something worse. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps circling me in the darkness. Not the random sounds of an animal moving through the forest, but the calculated movements of something that knew exactly where I was and was choosing its moment. The footsteps would get closer, close enough that I could hear breathing, then fade away only to resume from a different direction. And they weren't alone. As my ears adjusted to the unnatural quiet, I could pick out other sounds moving through the forest around me. Footsteps of different weights and rhythms, as if multiple figures were coordinating their movements, herding me toward some predetermined destination. I drew my service weapon. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is a federal ranger. Identify yourself." The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something that made my blood freeze, my own voice, calling back from the darkness. "Who's there? This is a federal ranger. Identify yourself." It was perfect mimicry, down to the slight tremor I'd tried to hide, but it was coming from somewhere in the trees above me, as if something were perched in the canopy, throwing my words back down. Then another voice joined it. Vera's voice, the same one that had led me off the trail. "Help me. Please. Silas, help me." But how did it know my name? The voices multiplied, became a chorus. My voice, Vera's voice, other voices I didn't recognize, all calling out from different directions in the darkness, some pleading for help, others laughing, still others speaking in urgent whispers I couldn't quite understand. And mixed in with the human voices were others, sounds that might have been words but in no language I'd ever heard, guttural and wet, like something speaking through a mouthful of mud. One voice stood out from the others, my sister Sarah's voice, but not as she sounded now. It was her voice as a child, crying for help in that corn maze 20 years ago. "Silas, Silas, where are you? I'm scared, Silas, please find me." I backed against one of the massive tree trunks, trying to put something solid at my back, my gun trained on the darkness ahead of me. The bark felt strange under my hand, warm, almost pulsing, like skin rather than wood. And it was wet, though it hadn't rained in days. That's when the light appeared. It was faint at first, just a glimmer between the trees, but it was moving with purpose, not flickering randomly like a firefly. As it got closer, I could see it was a flashlight beam, sweeping back and forth in a search pattern. "Over here," I called out, relief flooding through me. "I'm over here." The light stopped, then turned directly toward me. As it approached, I could make out the silhouette of a person behind it, tall, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew these woods. "You lost, Ranger?" The voice was male, gruff, with a slight accent I couldn't place. "My equipment failed," I explained, holstering my weapon as the figure got closer. "GPS, radio, everything went dead at once. I was following a voice I thought was the missing hiker." The man laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "Yeah, the voices'll do that. Lead you right off the trail if you're not careful." He was close enough now that I could see him in the backwash of his flashlight, A large man, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and a thick beard. He wore military-style clothing, all dark colors, and moved with the bearing of someone with tactical training. "You know about the voices?" I asked. "Hell yes, I know about the voices. Been hunting these woods for 15 years. Name's Burke. Dale Burke." He extended a hand, which I shook gratefully. "Silas Brennan, Park Service. Have you seen a woman out here? Vera Castellanos? She's been missing since yesterday." Burke's expression changed, became unreadable. Pretty little thing, dark hair, had a fancy camera. "Yes, that's her. You've seen her?" "Oh, I've seen her all right." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Matter of fact, she's the reason I'm out here tonight." Something in his tone made me take a step back. "What do you mean?" "See, Ranger Brennan, there's things about this forest that the Park Service don't tell people. Things that have been here a lot longer than your trails and your regulations." He played his flashlight beam around the surrounding trees, and I noticed for the first time how wrong they looked. Twisted, bark hanging in sheets like diseased skin. This particular section, well, let's just say it's got a reputation. Indians used to avoid it, called it a place where the world was thin, where things from the other side could bleed through. The voices started up again, distant but getting closer. Multiple voices now, some recognizable, others alien. "You hear that?" Burke asked, tilting his head. "They're getting active. Means we're close." "Close to what?" His smile widened, and in the flashlight's glow, his teeth looked too sharp. "To where I keep the pretty ones." I went for my gun, but Burke was faster than a man his size should have been. His hand clamped down on my wrist like a vice, squeezing until I dropped the weapon. Now, Ranger. No need for that. You're gonna come along peaceful-like, and I'm gonna show you what happened to your missing hiker. And then..." His grip tightened until I felt bones grinding together. "Well, then we'll see how long you last." The voices in the darkness were getting closer, but now I realized they weren't supernatural at all. They were recordings, a sophisticated sound system that Burke had set up throughout this section of forest. The mimicry, the impossible directions, even the child crying. All of it technology being used to lure people off the trail. But that didn't explain everything. My equipment had failed before I'd encountered Burke, before I'd heard the first voice. And the forest itself had changed around me, become something alien and hostile. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked, still trying to process what was happening. Doing what? Playing with lost hikers? Burke started walking, dragging me along by my captured wrist. "Oh, about 5 years now. Ever since I figured out that this place amplifies things, makes my little game so much more effective." We were moving deeper into the forest, away from anything that might resemble a trail. Burke's flashlight beam revealed a landscape that looked increasingly unnatural. Trees growing in perfect spirals, rocks arranged in geometric patterns, areas where the ground seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. As we walked, Burke kept up a steady stream of conversation, as if he were giving a tour rather than leading me to my death. "You know, most people think predators are born, not made. But that's not true. I was a normal guy once. Army sergeant, served 2 tours in Afghanistan, came home to a wife and kids in Tacoma. Had a good life, you know. But then Jessica, that's my wife, she decided she wanted a divorce. Took the kids, took half of everything, moved in with some accountant who'd never held a gun in his life." His grip on my wrist never loosened as he talked, but I could hear something in his voice. Not regret exactly, but a kind of nostalgia for the person he used to be. "I started coming out here to hunt just to clear my head. Normal hunting at first, deer, elk, nothing special. But then I found this place." He gestured around us with his free hand. "And it found me." The trees we were passing were wrong in ways that went beyond the supernatural. Some of them had bark that looked like scales, others grew in impossible spirals that made me dizzy to look at, and all of them seemed to be leaning in toward us, creating a tunnel effect that made me feel like we were walking through the throat of some massive beast. See, most predators, they hunt for food, for territory, basic survival stuff. But this place, it hunts for different reasons. It's hungry, but not for meat. It feeds on fear, on despair, on the moment when a person realizes they're not going to make it home. Burke stopped suddenly, tilting his head like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Yeah, I know," he said to the darkness around us. "I'm bringing him. Just be patient." "Who are you talking to?" I asked. Burke looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You really don't understand yet, do you? This isn't just about me, Ranger. I'm just the middleman. The forest itself is what you should be worried about." As if to emphasize his point, the trees around us began to move, not swaying in the wind. There was no wind, but actually repositioning themselves, roots pulling free from the earth with wet, sucking sounds, branches reaching out to touch us as we passed. The ground under our feet shifted and flowed like water, creating a path that led inexorably forward toward whatever destination the forest had chosen. "It started about 5 years ago," Burke continued, seemingly oblivious to the impossible things happening around us. "I was out here hunting alone, got turned around in the fog, ended up in a part of the forest I'd never seen before, even though I'd been hunting these woods for years. That's when I heard the voices for the first time. We crested a small hill, and I could see lights ahead. Not electric lights, but something that flickered and danced like candles or torches. As we got closer, I realized they were coming from what looked like a small cabin, though the architecture was wrong, angles that didn't quite meet properly, walls that seemed to curve when they should be straight. The voices told me things," Burke went on, "about the history of this place, about what it really was. Did you know that the local tribes used to bring sacrifices here? Not animal sacrifices, human ones. They understood what this place needed to stay satisfied. The cabin was surrounded by a clearing that hurt to look at directly. The trees formed perfect geometric patterns that made my eyes water, and in the spaces between them, I could see movement, shapes that weren't quite human darting between the shadows. But then the white settlers came, drove off the tribes, forgot the old agreements. The forest got hungry. That's when the disappearances started. Loggers, hunters, hikers. 1 or 2 a year at first, then more as the hunger grew. Burke dragged me toward the cabin, and I could see now that it wasn't a cabin at all. It was made of bones, human bones, arranged in intricate patterns and held together with what looked like dried sinew. The windows were empty eye sockets, the door a gaping mouth lined with teeth. "I became the new caretaker," Burke said with obvious pride. "The forest chose me, taught me how to hunt more efficiently, how to use the voices, how to manipulate the terrain, how to make people come to me instead of having to chase them down." Through the bone windows of the structure, I could see movement inside, and I could hear sounds that made my skin crawl. Whimpering, pleading, the sound of someone trying to scream through a gag. "Vera," I whispered. "Oh yes, she's in there, along with the others. The forest likes to keep them alive for a while, lets their fear ripen like fruit on the vine, makes the feeding more satisfying." But as he said this, I noticed something strange. Burke's voice was getting weaker, more strained, as if talking was becoming an effort. And the hand gripping my wrist felt different, colder, with a texture that didn't feel entirely human. "How many others?" I asked, trying to keep him talking while I looked for any opportunity to escape. "Over the years, maybe 30, 40 people, hard to keep count. The forest processes them differently depending on what it needs at the time. Some get consumed quickly, others..." He gestured toward the bone cabin. "Others become part of the architecture." That's when I realized what I was looking at. The bones weren't just arranged randomly. They were positioned to preserve the skeletal structure of the people they'd come from. Dozens of complete skeletons, all arranged to form the walls and framework of the impossible building. "And you?" I asked. "What happens to you when the forest is done with you?" Burke's laugh was hollow, echoing strangely in the clearing. "That's the beautiful part, Ranger. I don't die. I don't age. I don't get sick or tired or lonely. I just hunt and feed the forest, and in return it keeps me exactly as I am, forever." But even as he said it, I could see that wasn't entirely true. Up close, in the flickering light from the bone cabin, Burke looked wrong. His skin had a waxy quality that didn't reflect light properly, and his eyes were starting to develop a milky film that made them look like those of a dead fish. Whatever bargain he'd made with this place, it was slowly consuming him from the inside out. The only problem, Burke continued, his voice now barely above a whisper, is that the forest's appetite keeps growing. What used to satisfy it with one person a year now takes 5, 6. Soon it'll need more than that. Soon it'll need whole groups, families, maybe even tour buses full of people. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just about isolated hikers disappearing in the wilderness. This was about something that was growing stronger, hungrier, more ambitious with each feeding. That's why you're here, Ranger. You're not just another victim. You're a recruitment opportunity. The forest wants someone younger, stronger, someone who can bring it more food, someone who knows how the Park Service operates, who can manipulate search and rescue operations. Never, I said. Burke shrugged. That's what I said at first. But the forest is very persuasive and very patient. It'll keep you alive in there for weeks, months if necessary, showing you things, teaching you things until you understand that resistance is pointless. We had reached the entrance to the bone cabin. Up close, I could see that the door wasn't just shaped like a mouth. It was an actual mouth lined with teeth that looked disturbingly human. And it was breathing, the jaw opening and closing slightly with each exhalation. Before we go in, Burke said, I want you to understand something. Everything you've experienced tonight, the equipment failures, the changing forest, the voices, that's just the forest getting to know you, learning your fears, your weaknesses, your pressure points. Once you're inside, it'll really start to work on you. The sounds from inside the cabin were getting louder, more desperate. I could clearly make out Vera's voice now, calling my name, begging for help. But there were other voices too. Men, women, children, all pleading for rescue that would never come. The beautiful thing, Burke said, his voice now so quiet I had to strain to hear it, is that once you're in there, you'll stop feeling guilty about what you have to do. The forest will show you that humans are just another resource like trees or water, that our supposed civilization is just a thin veneer over our animal nature, that predation is the most honest relationship one living thing can have with another. As he spoke, I noticed that his grip on my wrist was loosening, not because he was letting me go, but because his hand was becoming less solid, less substantial. In the flickering light, I could see through him in places, as if he were fading away. Burke, I said, look at yourself. He glanced down at his hand, then at his arms, and for the first time since I'd met him, his confident expression faltered. No, he whispered. Not yet. I've been good. I've fed it everything it asked for. But the transformation was accelerating. Burke was becoming translucent, his features starting to blur and shift. The thing that had been pretending to be a man was revealing its true nature, something made of shadow and hunger, held together by will and the forest's power. This always happens, a new voice said from behind me. The forest uses them up, then discards them when they're no longer useful. I spun around to see a woman stepping out from behind one of the trees, middle-aged, wearing hiking clothes that had seen better days. She looked normal, human, except for her eyes. They were completely black, reflecting no light at all. Who are you? I asked. I was Burke's predecessor, she said simply. Before him there was someone else. Before that, someone else. The forest has been making these bargains for a very long time. Burke, or what was left of him, was now barely visible, just a whisper of shadow clinging to human form. No, he was saying over and over. I did everything right. I followed the rules. The only rule, the woman said, is that the forest's hunger always grows, and eventually, even the hunters become the hunted. With that, Burke dissolved completely, leaving nothing but a faint smell of sulfur and decay. The pressure on my wrist vanished, and I was free. But I wasn't alone. See, most people think the supernatural and the practical can't coexist, Burke continued conversationally. But they're wrong. This place has its own intelligence, its own hunger. I just give it what it wants, and in return it helps me with my work. What happened to Vera? Oh, she's still alive. For now. Took me 2 days to break her down, and she's still got some fight left. Been using her voice for my recordings. Nothing quite like genuine terror to make the sound believable. The implications of what he was saying hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just a predator using technology to hunt humans. This was something far worse. Burke had somehow formed a partnership with whatever made this part of the forest so hostile to human presence. "You're insane," I said. "Am I? Look around you, Ranger. Look at where we are." I did look, and felt my sanity strain at what I saw. We were standing in a clearing that shouldn't exist. A perfect circle of bare ground surrounded by trees that grew in a precise geometric pattern. In the center of the clearing was a structure that hurt to look at directly. Angles that folded in on themselves in ways that defied perspective. And hanging from the trees around the clearing were cages. Crude things made of branches and wire, but functional. Most were empty, but in 2 of them I could see movement. "Vera!" I called out. A weak voice answered from one of the cages. "Silas. Oh God, Silas, is that you?" But Burke was already dragging me toward an empty cage, one that looked like it had been recently constructed. "Don't worry, Ranger. You won't be alone for long. I've got another hiker coming through tomorrow, guided by your voice calling for help. Young couple from Seattle. They'll make good company." I fought then, putting everything I had into breaking free from his grip. But Burke was stronger than he looked, and the moment I started to struggle seriously, the forest itself seemed to turn against me. Branches reached down to snag my clothing, roots erupted from the ground to trip me, and the air became thick, hard to breathe. "Like I said," Burke grunted as he forced me toward the cage, "this place and I have an understanding." But as he opened the cage door, something unexpected happened. My radio, which had been dead for hours, suddenly crackled to life. "Brennan, this is Ranger Station. Do you copy?" Burke froze, staring at the radio clipped to my belt. "That's impossible. Nothing electronic works in here unless I allow it." Chief Voss's voice came through clearly. "Brennan, we're tracking your GPS signal. Search team is en route to your location. ETA 15 minutes. The GPS unit in my pack began beeping, its screen flickering back to life. My backup flashlight clicked on by itself, cutting through the darkness. Burke's face contorted with rage. "No, this is my place. Mine." But something was changing in the clearing. The geometric precision of the trees was wavering, branches shifting back to more natural positions. The impossible structure in the center flickered like a mirage, occasionally revealing what looked like a simple hunting blind made of branches and camouflage netting. "The spell's breaking," Vera called weakly from her cage. "When the rescue team gets close enough, this place can't maintain the illusion. It's not strong enough to fool multiple people at once." Burke spun toward her cage, pulling a hunting knife from his belt. "Then I'll finish this now." But I was ready for him. With my equipment working again, with the unnatural influence of the clearing weakening, I felt more like myself. I tackled Burke before he could reach Vera's cage, and we went down hard. He was still stronger than me, still had the advantage of knowing this terrain, but now we were fighting on something closer to equal terms. As we struggled for the knife, I could hear the sound of voices in the distance. Real voices this time, calling my name. "Brennan, where are you?" The rescue team. They'd found us. Burke heard them too, and the sound seemed to drain all the fight out of him. He sagged beneath me, suddenly looking like what he really was. A sick old man who'd been using a combination of technology and the forest's natural disorienting effects to terrorize people. "You don't understand," he whispered. "This place, it needs to feed. It's been hungry for so long. If I don't bring it what it wants." But whatever he was going to say was cut off as flashlight beams swept across the clearing. The rescue team had found us. What followed was a blur of activity. EMTs treating Vera and the other victim Burke had caged, a backpacker who'd gone missing 3 weeks earlier. Burke taken into custody, ranting about bargains and hunger and things that lived in the spaces between trees. Me giving statement after statement, trying to explain what had happened in terms that made sense. The official report listed Burke as a serial killer who used sophisticated audio equipment and his knowledge of the forest's natural maze-like qualities to confuse and capture victims. The strange effects I'd experienced, the equipment failures, the changing landscape, the impossible geometry, were attributed to stress, disorientation, and the forest's well-documented ability to confuse navigation equipment due to magnetic anomalies in the rock formations. That's the version that went in the files. That's the version that made sense to everyone involved. But it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain how Burke managed to set up his elaborate sound system in a part of the forest that supposedly had no trails, no power source, no way to maintain the equipment. It doesn't explain how he could have lived out there for months at a time without any visible shelter or supplies. And it definitely doesn't explain what happened to the clearing. When the investigation team returned the next day to document the crime scene, they found nothing. No geometric arrangement of trees, no impossible structure, no cages hanging from branches. Just a normal patch of forest, indistinguishable from thousands of others in the park. The audio equipment was never found. Neither was any evidence of how Burke had powered his elaborate deception. Burke himself died in custody 3 days after his arrest. The official cause was a heart attack, but the guards reported that he'd spent his last night screaming about something in his cell, clawing at the walls until his fingers bled, begging for forgiveness from something that wouldn't let him go. Vera recovered physically, but she never spoke about what happened during her captivity. She moved back to Portland, quit photography, and as far as I know, never set foot in a forest again. I lasted another 2 months as a ranger before I couldn't take it anymore. The nightmares were constant, not just about Burke, but about the voices, the changing forest, the sensation that something vast and hungry was still out there, waiting. Every time I patrolled that section of the park, I could feel it watching me. So I quit, packed up everything I owned, and moved as far away as I could get. Here in Arizona, the desert is clean, open, honest. What you see is what you get. No ancient forests with their own agenda. No places where reality gets thin and things bleed through. But sometimes late at night when the wind is howling across the desert, I still hear them. The voices. Calling my name. Asking me to come back. Promising that next time will be different. And the worst part? Sometimes I want to go. Because even now, 7 years later, I'm not entirely sure what really happened in that clearing. Was Burke just a sick man who used technology and psychology to create the illusion of supernatural events? Or was there something else in those woods? Something that had been there long before Burke arrived, and will be there long after he's gone? I think about Vera sometimes, wonder if she knows something she's never told anyone. Wonder if the reason she won't talk about those 3 days isn't trauma, but knowledge. Knowledge that some places on this earth are wrong in ways that can't be explained or understood, only survived. The official report says Burke acted alone, that there was no supernatural element to his crimes. But the report doesn't mention the other disappearances over the years, the hikers who vanished in that same section of forest decades before Burke arrived. It doesn't mention the Native American legends about that area, or why the local tribes still avoid it. And it definitely doesn't mention what I saw in Burke's eyes during those last moments in the clearing. It wasn't the look of a man who'd been caught in his crimes. It was the look of a man who'd broken a contract he never should have made and was terrified of the consequences. I'm telling this story now because I read something in the news last week. Another hiker has gone missing in Olympic National Park. A young photographer from Oregon, following the same route Vera had planned to take. Her name is Sarah Chen, and according to the report, she was last seen heading toward the Bogachil River area, the same area where everything happened. Part of me wants to believe it's just a coincidence. People get lost in the wilderness all the time, and Olympic is a big, dangerous place even without supernatural influences. But part of me, the part that still wakes up hearing voices in the wind, knows better. That place is still hungry, and it's still feeding. If you're planning to visit Olympic National Park, please, stay on the marked trails. Don't chase voices calling for help, no matter how real they sound. Don't trust your equipment if it starts behaving strangely. And if you find yourself in a part of the forest where the trees grow in perfect patterns and the ground pulses with its own rhythm, run. Run. and don't look back. Because some places aren't meant for human beings. Some places have appetites that can't be satisfied, only temporarily sated. And some bargains, once made, echo through time long after the people who made them are gone. I've spent 7 years trying to convince myself that what happened in that clearing was just a man's madness amplified by my own fear and confusion. 7 years telling myself that there's a rational explanation for everything, but deep down, in the part of my mind that still remembers what it felt like to stand in that impossible place, I know the truth. Olympic National Park has secrets older than human civilization, and some of those secrets are still very much alive. Sarah Chen is still missing. The search was called off after 2 weeks, no trace found. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed. If I should have become what Burke was, a guardian of sorts, someone who understood the bargain and could control it, someone who could feed the forest what it needed while protecting everyone else. But then I remember Burke's face in those final moments, the terror and regret, the understanding that he'd sold his soul for power he could never really control. No. I made the right choice coming to Arizona. Here, the only things that hunt humans are other humans, and that's a kind of evil I can understand. Out there in those ancient forests, where the trees remember things that happened before history began, there are hungers that go deeper than human madness. There are places where the rules we think govern reality become flexible. And there are voices, still calling in the darkness, promising answers to questions we're not meant to ask. I hope Sarah Chen is just lost. I hope she found her way out of the forest and decided to start a new life somewhere far away, like I did. But I don't think that's what happened, and God help me, part of me is tempted to go back and find out for sure. But I won't. I can't. Because if I'm right about what that place really is, then going back would mean becoming part of it. And there are already enough voices calling from those woods. They don't need mine added to the chorus. Hello, my name is Marcus Thornfield, and I'm 29 years old. I currently live in Arizona, but I found your channel after searching for people who might understand what I went through. This happened 4 years ago, when I still worked as a forest ranger at Great Smoky Mountains National Park on the Tennessee-North Carolina border. What I'm going to tell you is the reason why I left that job, moved clear across the country to the desert, and why I can't stand the sound of children laughing anymore. I had been working there for only 18 months when Cassandra Vex's case happened. I was still pretty green, still trying to prove I belonged in those ancient mountains. What started as my chance to show I could handle a serious case turned into something that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. To this day, 4 years later, here in the Arizona desert where there's nothing but rock and sky and blessed silence, I still wake up hearing those voices echoing through mountain hollows that shouldn't exist. Sorry if I have to stop sometimes. My therapist says talking about it helps, but this is the first time I'm telling the whole story to anyone outside of the VA. My girlfriend thinks I should let it go, but people who follow channels like yours, you deserve to know that there are things in those mountains. Old things. Hungry things. Let me start from the beginning. October 23rd, 2020. I remember the date exactly because it was a Friday, and I was supposed to have my first weekend off in a month. The autumn in the Smokies is something people travel thousands of miles to see. The mountains rolling away in layers of gold and crimson and orange, mist hanging in the valleys like the breath of sleeping giants. Nothing like Arizona, where I live now. Here everything is exposed, harsh, honest. The desert doesn't hide anything. But those Tennessee mountains, they keep secrets. I was a rookie, 18 months on the job, still eager to prove myself to the veterans who'd been working those ridges since before I was born. When the call came in about Cassandra Vex, I volunteered immediately. Missing person cases were rare enough that handling one successfully could make a career. Cassandra was 31, a wildlife researcher from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. She'd been studying migration patterns of black bears preparing for winter hibernation, specifically in the remote areas around Cades Cove and Cataract Falls. Professional, experienced, with all the right permits and equipment. She'd been in radio contact with her research partner every evening at 6 p.m. sharp for 2 weeks. Until she wasn't. When she missed her Thursday evening check-in, her partner waited until Friday morning before calling us. Standard protocol. But when I saw her research notes, something felt wrong immediately. Cassandra hadn't just been studying bear migration. Her real focus was on what she called anomalous disappearance patterns. People who'd vanished in the Smokies over the past 50 years, all in the same general area around an old Cherokee settlement called Kitua Hollow. 18 people over 5 decades, all experienced hikers or researchers. All disappeared during autumn months. All last seen in the vicinity of what the Cherokee called the shadow walking grounds. I'd never heard of Kitua Hollow, and I'd studied every map of the park. When I asked my supervisor, Ranger Coleman, about it, his expression went dark. "You don't go to Kitua Hollow," he said. "Not alone, not ever. And if someone's missing there, we call in the FBI and let them handle it." But this was 2020. COVID had the FBI stretched thin, and they couldn't spare agents for a missing researcher who might have just had radio trouble. Coleman assigned the case to me with explicit instructions. Find her quick, bring her back, and don't go wandering off into areas that aren't on the official maps. The problem was Cassandra's GPS tracker showed her last known position was exactly in one of those areas. I started at her base camp near Cataract Falls. Everything was pristine. Tent properly secured, food stored correctly, equipment organized with scientific precision. But her research journal was open to a page that made my skin crawl. Day 14. Found the burial markers. Local Cherokee legends speak of a place where the dead don't rest properly, where shadow walkers emerge during the thin months, autumn, to hunt the living. Interviewed Elder Thomas Sequoia, age 78, in Cherokee, NC. He became visibly distressed when I mentioned Kitua Hollow, said white people have been feeding the shadows there since 1872. Claims his great-grandfather witnessed something that wasn't human hunting a lost surveyor near the old settlement. Investigating tomorrow. The entry was dated October 22nd, yesterday. Below that, in different handwriting, shakier, more frantic. They're real. The shadow walkers are real. Someone is using them. Someone is calling them. I can hear the children singing. I radioed base immediately. "Coleman, this is Thornfield. I'm at the researchers' camp. Her journal mentions interviewing a Cherokee elder about local legends. We might want to contact tribal authorities." Static then. "Negative, Thornfield. This is a standard missing person case. Follow her GPS trail and bring her back. No side investigations." But the GPS trail led directly into terrain that didn't match any topographical map I'd ever seen. According to my equipment, Cassandra had walked straight through a mountain. I followed her path anyway. The official trail ended at a scenic overlook, but there were obvious signs she'd continued. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, boot prints in the soft soil. The prints led to what looked like a game trail winding down into a hollow that shouldn't have existed. As I descended, the temperature dropped noticeably. Not unusual for mountain valleys, but this was different. The cold felt intentional, like something was drawing the warmth out of the air. And that's when I heard the first child. "Help me. I'm scared." Distant, maybe half a mile ahead. High-pitched voice, maybe 8 or 9 years old. I keyed my radio. "Base, this is Thornfield. Possible survivor contact." Child's voice requesting immediate backup. But the radio only produced static. I checked the battery. Full. Signal strength. 0. In 18 months, I'd never hit a dead zone this close to base. I followed the voice deeper into the hollow. The trees here were wrong. Massive chestnuts that should have been wiped out by blight decades ago. Their trunks scarred with symbols that looked almost like Cherokee syllabary, but not quite. The canopy was so thick that even at midday it felt like twilight. The child's voice came again, but from a different direction. "Please help me. The man is coming." I changed course, pushing through underbrush that seemed to grow thicker with every step, but the voice kept moving, always just out of reach, always crying for help. That's when I found the first marker. It was a cairn, stack of stones about 3 feet high, but the stones were arranged in a pattern I'd never seen. 7 stones forming a spiral with smaller rocks filling the gaps. Fresh pine boughs were woven between the stones, and there was something dark staining the rocks. Something that looked like dried blood. I photographed it and kept moving. 50 yards later, another cairn, same pattern, same stains, then another. They formed a line leading deeper into the hollow, like breadcrumbs marking a trail. But breadcrumbs leading to what? The child's voice came again, closer now. He's here. He's coming. Run. I rounded a bend in the trail and froze. There was a settlement in the hollow, not ruins, an active settlement. Wooden structures that looked like they'd been built in the 1800s but maintained with modern materials. Smoke rising from chimneys, gardens with late-season vegetables, clothes hanging on lines. But it was completely silent. No voices, no movement, no signs of life despite clear evidence of recent habitation. In the center of the settlement was a structure that made my throat close up with primitive fear. It looked like a church, but the proportions were wrong. Too tall, too narrow, with windows placed at odd angles. The door was standing open, and darkness seemed to pour out of it like smoke. Carved above the door, in perfect Cherokee syllabary, were symbols I couldn't read. But underneath in English, Kitua Hollow, SD, 1872, where the shadows walk. I approached carefully, hand on my service weapon. The steps creaked under my feet, and the sound echoed strangely, like the echo was coming from underground rather than the surrounding mountains. Inside, the church was lit by dozens of candles, their flames flickering without any breeze. The pews were filled with people, dead people. Mummified remains in period clothing, sitting upright as if attending a service. Men, women, children, all perfectly preserved by the dry mountain air. Their eye sockets were empty, but they all faced toward the pulpit where a figure in modern hiking gear was tied to a wooden post. Cassandra. She was alive but unconscious, her head hanging forward. Around her neck was a necklace of small bones. Finger bones, I realized with horror. Human finger bones. I rushed toward her, but a voice from the back of the church stopped me cold. I wouldn't do that if I were you. I spun around. A man stepped out from behind the last pew, tall, lean, dressed in modern camouflage but wearing a necklace of animal teeth and Cherokee-style shell beads. His face was painted with symbols in red and black, and his eyes reflected light like an animal's. "You're trespassing on sacred ground," he said, voice calm and conversational. "The ancestors don't like trespassers." "I'm a federal officer," I managed. "Release the woman and come with me peacefully." He laughed, and the sound echoed from the throats of the mummified congregation. "Federal officer? In Kitua Hollow? This place doesn't recognize your authority, boy. This place follows older laws." As he spoke, the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. My breath began to fog, and frost started forming on the wooden pews. "See, your researcher friend here was asking questions about the shadow walkers, about the old stories, so I decided to show her the truth." He gestured toward the mummified bodies. "These people have been attending my services for 150 years. They're very good listeners." The candle flames flickered, and for a moment I could swear I saw the mummified heads turn toward me. "The Cherokee knew this place was wrong," he continued. "Knew something lived here that shouldn't, but they also knew how to use it, how to feed it, how to make it work for them instead of against them." One of the child mummies in the front row opened its mouth and began to sing. A Cherokee lullaby, hauntingly beautiful but wrong. The voice was coming from a throat that had been dry for decades. "You see, the shadow walkers aren't evil," the man said as more mummies began to join the song. "They're just hungry. And if you feed them properly, they'll hunt for you, bring you what you need." The singing grew louder, more voices joining in. But these weren't the voices of the mummified children. These were the voices I'd been hearing all day. Fresh voices, recent voices. "What did you feed them?" I whispered. His smile was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Researchers, hikers, anyone who came asking too many questions about disappearances in the Smokies. I've been feeding them for 30 years, and they've been very grateful." The singing reached a crescendo, and the church began to shake. Not an earthquake, Something was moving underneath the building. Something large. "And now," he said, pulling a knife from his belt, "it's time for tonight's service." But as he moved toward Cassandra, something unexpected happened. The mummies stopped singing and began to scream. Not the dry wheeze you'd expect from ancient throats. Full-throated, agonized screams of pure terror. They weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at something behind me. I turned around and saw them. The Shadow Walkers. They poured through the open door like living darkness, but with substance and weight. Human-shaped but wrong. Too tall, too thin, with fingers that ended in points and faces that were just suggestions of features in the blackness. And they weren't looking at me or Cassandra. They were looking at him. "No," he whispered. "No, I've been feeding you. I've been faithful. I've brought you what you needed." The largest Shadow Walker spoke, and its voice was like wind through dead leaves. "You have fed us the innocent, but the innocent are not what we hunger for." "We hunger for the guilty," said another, "for those who spill blood on sacred ground. For those who desecrate the resting places of our people," said a third. The man backed against the pulpit, knife shaking in his hand. "But I was serving you. I was doing what you wanted." "You were serving yourself," the first Shadow Walker replied, "using our name to justify your hunger for death, using our sacred places for your own evil." The temperature in the church plummeted. Ice began forming on the walls, and the candle flames turned blue. 30 years, the Shadow Walker continued. "We have waited for justice. 30 years we have watched you corrupt our hollow with your murders. No more." They moved toward him like flowing water, and his screams joined those of the mummified congregation. But the mummies weren't screaming in terror anymore. They were screaming in joy, in release. As the Shadow Walkers reached him, the man's body began to change. His skin grew dark and papery. His eyes sank into his skull, his flesh desiccated like the others. But unlike the peaceful mummies in the pews, his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror. When it was over, he took his place at the back of the church, just another member of the congregation. The largest Shadow Walker turned to me. "You should not be here, young ranger. This place is not for the living." "The woman," I managed through chattering teeth. "Is she?" "She lives. She sought truth about the disappearances, not to cause harm, but to bring justice. We do not punish the just." The Shadow Walker moved to Cassandra and cut her bonds with a finger that was sharp as any blade. She collapsed, but I could see her breathing. "Take her from this place," the Shadow Walker said. "Tell your people that the disappearances in Kitua Hollow have ended. The one who caused them has been dealt with." I lifted Cassandra over my shoulder and stumbled toward the door. As I reached the threshold, the Shadow Walker spoke again. "Young Ranger, you have seen the truth of this place. You know now that there are older laws than those written by men. Speak of this to no one, or we will be forced to ensure your silence." I nodded frantically and ran. I carried Cassandra for what felt like hours through terrain that no longer matched my maps. But eventually, I emerged at the scenic overlook where I'd lost the official trail. My radio crackled to life immediately. "Thornfield, this is base. Report your status." I looked at my watch. It was 6 p.m. I'd been gone for 8 hours, but it felt like days. "Base, this is Thornfield. I have the missing researcher. She's alive but unconscious, requesting immediate medical evacuation. Cassandra spent a week in the hospital with severe hypothermia and what doctors called acute stress reaction. When she finally started talking, she had no memory of anything after entering the hollow. The doctor said it was trauma-induced amnesia, her mind protecting itself from whatever she'd experienced. But sometimes when she thought no one was listening, she would whisper about the singing children and the man with painted face and the shadows that walk like people. The official report listed her case as lost hiker recovered exposure-related trauma. My experience was classified as routine search and rescue with environmental complications. But 3 things happened after that made me know I couldn't stay in those mountains. First, they found a body near Cataract Falls. Male, approximately 45-50 years old, mummified beyond recognition. The medical examiner estimated he'd been dead for decades, but his clothes were modern hiking gear. No identification, no way to determine who he was or how he'd gotten there. Second, the disappearances in the Smoky Mountains stopped completely, not just in the Kitua Hollow area, throughout the entire park. After averaging 2 or 3 missing persons per year for 50 years, we didn't lose a single hiker in the following 6 months. Third, I started having dreams. Every night I would dream I was back in that church, surrounded by the mummified congregation. But in the dreams, they would turn to look at me with empty eye sockets and speak in unison. "You know the truth now, young ranger. You carry our secret. Do not burden others with what they cannot understand." I lasted another 2 months before I put in for a transfer. But there were no ranger positions available anywhere in the continental United States that would take me far enough away from those mountains. So I quit. I moved to Arizona, bought a house in Phoenix where the nearest forest is 200 miles away. I got a job with the State Parks Department managing desert preserves, places with no trees, no shadows, no hollows where things can hide. I tell people I wanted a career change, wanted to experience different ecosystems. The truth is, I can't handle the sound of children's voices anymore. Even here in the desert, when kids are playing in my neighborhood, I have to go inside and turn on loud music to drown out the sound. Because sometimes, just for a moment, those children's voices sound like they're calling for help. And sometimes they sound like they're singing Cherokee lullabies. My girlfriend thinks I have PTSD from my time as a ranger, and maybe she's right. Maybe everything I experienced was hallucination brought on by stress and carbon monoxide poisoning from an old mine shaft. Maybe the shadow walkers were just oxygen deprivation, and the mummified congregation was just a fever dream. But last month, I got a package in the mail. No return address, postmarked from Cherokee, North Carolina. Inside was a small carved wooden figure, a Cherokee warrior with traditional paint and clothing, and a note written in perfect syllabary. I had to drive to the University of Arizona to find someone who could translate it. The note said, "The Truth Keeper lives in the desert now. The ancestors remember your courage. The hollow sleeps peacefully." I keep the carving on my desk at work. Sometimes, when the desert heat becomes oppressive and I find myself missing the cool mountain air of Tennessee, I look at it and remember why I left. There are places in this world where the laws of men mean nothing. Places where older powers hold sway, where justice follows paths we can't understand. The Cherokee knew this. They knew some places were not meant for the living, and sometimes, those places fight back. That's my story. I know how it sounds, like something out of a ghost story or ancient legend, but I've told you everything exactly as I remember it, exactly as it happened. If you're ever hiking in the Smoky Mountains, especially in autumn when the mist rolls through the hollows, remember that some trails aren't on any official map. Some places have their own rules, their own guardians. And if you ever hear children singing Cherokee lullabies where no children should be, turn around and walk away. Some truths are too dangerous for the living to know.